Something was driving me. I mean, once again, it was like, a vein had been opened, and it was really making me kind of examine and wring out every sort of ounce of humanity that I could actually experience, to imagine. It's always been about the struggle and survival, and that's what fascinates people. Coastal command to fly over these great stretches of water looking for U-boats, never knowing ever if they're going to come back.
The byline for the Fighting High podcast is making their story our history, and I recently had the pleasure of a conversation with author Melody Foreman, who does just that. Indeed, here at Fighting High, we're very much looking forward to the imminent release of Melody's book Love as Strong as Death. In this podcast, Melody and I discuss her previous books and her motivations for writing them, and I open by asking what drew Melody to wartime stories.
I think it's because it's driven by this intensity, this rawness, this experience of war that people have gone through over the centuries, that's drawn me into all sorts of facets of humanity in extreme circumstances. And I also feel it's very much linked to my own DNA, memory, if you like. Both my parents served in the Second World War. My mother was in the WAFs, and my father was in the Royal Engineers. And I lost both of them when I was very young. And I think there's always been part of me that wants to find out more and more and more about that time that they lived through and how it shaped their lives.
And you've explored that not just in writing books, you've journalism as well and television documentaries. I mean, how's that experience shaped the kind of writer you are?
Well, I think with the newspaper journalism, it was something I'd always wanted to do. As a child, I was a serial reader. I was brought up on adventure stories. I was brought up on this idea that life was going to be one big adventure. And it sort of followed through with this idea of journalism. And when I was very young, I got to know a few old newspaper journalists, and I thought they had incredibly interesting lives. And every time I met somebody, I wanted to hear about their life. I wanted to know a lot more about them. I loved history at school. I was very fortunate in many ways to study the Second World War. I had a teacher who'd served in the Second World War. So I think that's where I was going with that one. And the newspaper journalism, it taught me how to write to a formula. I did a qualification with the local newspaper company, a family company called the Kent Messenger Group, and they sent you away to learn how to do it and to work on the job. And I learned to write very short, sharp sentences for news journalism. But I always knew that my favourite style of writing was to write features. And then I knew all along that the next favourite thing was to write profile pieces on people, and to paint with words, if you like. And that was the way I started to kind of build up this possible idea that I'd always want to write a biography.
Yeah, and so now do you see yourself primarily as a historian, a storyteller, journalist, the lot?
It was like the ingredients of a kind of the biographer's cake, if you like. It was about combining all of those sort of specific ways of looking at people and listening to them, that maybe understand you needed the history for the context, you needed some of the psychology, you needed to have some kind of understanding of the human emotion. And when I went to university as a mature student, my chosen subject was drama and theatre studies. And from that, I ended up having a year study at the universities of Utrecht in Holland and Amsterdam, and I broadened my course a lot. So it helped introduce me into sort of ideas of narratology and the way our language was formed by all sorts of myths and fairy tales. And it all kind of bled into the storytelling, which kind of gave me a layer, if you like, and a motivation to lean towards biography. and the understanding of people and how they're going to react and respond in certain situations, really. And I guess some of the drama sort of bled into that as well. But I was very inspired recently. I watched an interview with the actor Richard Burton, and he said that if you look through history, especially Shakespeare's plays, you see how audiences have always been tremendously fascinated by defeated men. You look at Hamlet and King Lear and the Henrys, and this idea of hero that we have in us going right back to sort of warriors and things. If it doesn't end happily for them, it's always been about the struggle and survival. And that's what fascinates people.
Yeah, and storytelling is very much central to what we do at Fighting High as well, which obviously attracted us to the book that's about to come out, which we'll come on to. And you're very much, your books deal with the sort of memory, loss, remembrance of those themes emerge naturally, or were you drawn towards them in particular?
I think it was a combination of both in many ways. I've always been aware in many ways that memory can make us. I mean, we've all got photographs in suitcases from the past, and we can all look at objects like, oh, I remember that bag, or I remember that particular book, or I remember that toy, even. And back come these memories, and then asking ourselves why we keep objects, why we like the visceral. And that was very much evident when I wrote the book about the wreck hunter and, holding a piece of aircraft that had taken part in the Battle of Britain. It was like a sort of like a vein was opening, all these kind of ideas and imagination and the men who flew those aircraft, it all just started to sort of like flood through me. And that from that one object, it meant and does mean so much. So those little pieces of memory and artifact, there's no one that can deny that battle took place. And to me, that said so much out of seemingly nothing, but it said so much. Piece of perspex, piece of bakelite aerial that I've got on my mantelpiece from a hurricane that took part in the Battle of Britain that went down in my village. To anyone else, they just chuck it away as rubbish. But, I saw, found out about the pilot and the squadron and his life, and it all kind of builds, it's like a sort of building process.
Yeah, yeah, very much they're portals, aren't they, into the past
Yeah,
that
exactly.
help
Yeah,
us. Yeah,
brilliant way of describing it. Yeah.
yeah. Now, one of your best known books is A Spitfire Girl, and I had the delight of meeting Mary Ellis briefly when she came to the premiere of the Spitfire documentary, and I think she was just short of being 100 then, but she was able to still wear her ATA uniform to the premiere, which was fantastic. So, what was it like working with Mary and telling her story?
But where can I start? It's the most popular talk I do at the moment. People love hearing about Mary. So I was working freelance for historic aircraft collection, and they would take people up in a helicopter from beautiful Pent Farm, where it was very nostalgic, very 1940s landscape. And they would take people up in a helicopter. This is about 12 years ago, and people could take photograph of the Hurricane and the Spitfire that they owned, which was flying around. And it was a nice little occasion, very, very evocative, just 4 or 5 people at a time. And I said to them, wearing my PR hat, you ought to invite some veterans along. And I went searching for a female pilot. And I came across Mary, was still very much alive and very much kicking. And I invited her to the event so she could go up in the helicopter and see her beloved Spitfire flying again. And the first thing she said to me, she'd been flown in from the Isle of Wight and she landed in this chipmunk. And the first thing she said to me when she got out of the aircraft was, "Oh, it was so slow." So the pilot was, quite offended really, and he said ask her if she wanted to take controls, but she said no, she wouldn't, because it wasn't a Spitfire and it was going to be terribly slow. So I thought that was wonderful to come from a 95-year-old. It then suddenly dawned on me she was my biography. She was the one I had to write the book about, and I think it was 4 or 5 letters to and fro to ask if she'd allow me to come and visit her to start the interview process, etc. And every time I asked her, she said I didn't do anything. So she was something of an advocate for modesty. She was the queen of modesty. She said, I didn't do anything. I just had a lovely time flying aircraft. That's all she ever said. And of course, when I finally got invited to the house at Sandown on the Isle of Wight, I was shown the logbook and I saw there were more than 400 Spitfires logged in that logbook since October 1941 when she first joined. But she had been flying before that because she was one of the lucky women who managed to get her pilot's license, and her father hired an aircraft for her to fly in. So she was flying by the age of 16, 17. It was just in her. She said she always wanted to be a bird when she was a child and was throwing herself out of the bedroom window thinking she could fly. So yeah, it was just something she never ever considered she wouldn't do. And I love that idea of someone being born with this kind of like innate sense. They would fly, something she felt very strongly about. And then, of course, was absolutely thrilled when Pauline Gower interviewed her and said, "Well, if your test flight goes okay, in front of Joan Hughes, you'll be fine to be part of the ATA. We very much welcome you." And that's how I started talking to her. But sometimes during our various visits, because I was always getting the ferry over to see her, she didn't want to talk. She was very so modest about it. It was quite painful, and she'd rather sort of talk about my life and sort of chide me for not wanting to learn to fly. Well, I just never thought about it. It was something that, yeah, um, she maybe thought I could have been a bit more authentic with my questioning because I didn't, sort of fly an aircraft. But she could, yeah, she was always quite nervous, I think, about talking about it. She did remember a lot of her colleagues. She did remember her friend Dora Lang, who she shared a billet with at Hamburg. And Dora sadly died when a mosquito, she just taken off in this mosquito, and it just went vertical and just crashed down. And being made of wood, the aircraft just burst into flames, and Dora was killed, along with a little engineer called Janice Harrington. There were only 2 women engineers in the ATA. And Mary, she said to me, "Look, Dora wrote in my autograph book." She said, "But Pauline Gower gave me a day off when it happened and said, you've got to get back into flying again." And she said, "I really didn't want to. It was really tough for me to step back into the aircraft, and it taught me really." And this is something that the Wing Commander Paul Farn said to me from the Battle of Britain. And I got on very well with Paul, a great guy. He said, "I learned so quickly not to make any friends because you never knew. And although the ATA weren't going into action, um, it was very much a risk if they took off in the fog. It was their decision if they did that because they weren't a military operation. They were funded, as you probably know, Steve, by BOAC. But they had to wear a uniform because the RAF insisted on it. But it was very much their own call. If they flew in bad weather, that was their decision. But there was no pressure on them. But most of the women were so dedicated to transporting up to 4 or 5 aircraft a day all over to various ferry pools and squadrons. They felt as dutiful about it as anyone who was in the military. So Mary's personality was very stoic. She was a very stoic person, very measured, very dedicated to flying. And I found it interesting that you couldn't really read Mary's emotion, apart from if you offered to help her light her fire. If you helped her light the fire, she would get angry very quickly because she didn't want any help. And she'd say to me, "Oh, if anyone else tries to help me light the fire, I'm going to scream." And the last time I saw her when she was about 100, I think she was 100 then, she was standing on a coffee table changing a light bulb. And I'd say, "Do you want any help with that, Mary?" And I'd get shouted at for offering to assist. So for Mary, age had kind of like blended into this sort of, yeah, stoicism. She was a very strong, determined person who you knew when she was younger, you probably wouldn't want to mess with. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So you wrote the book From the Battlefield to the Big Screen, looking at actors and filmmakers. I mean, was there anything that surprised you when you were researching that?
That one began really with I was overwhelmed really because when I first looked at the amount of famous actors, writers, and directors who took part in the Second World War, I knew it'd be like a Promethean effort. I narrowed it down really to the idea of sort of lights, camera, action. For the lights, I thought about Laurence Olivier because the stage work. He was known for being on the stage, and he was already known when the war broke out. So what was he going to possibly contribute, this, Shakespearean actor, to the war effort? Well, for him, I discovered that he was desperate to be a pilot and take part in the Battle of Britain, but he was far too old. He was 37. So and all of the actors who were in Hollywood at the time were told by the British consul, Churchill says you've got to stay there, you've got to act as spies, and let us know what the German directors are up to, etc., etc. And of course, the Americans were just neutral because Pearl Harbor hadn't happened yet. So they were advised to stay in Hollywood to make British propaganda films and have English actors appearing there. But back home, the papers were just tearing them to pieces, calling them, they were just accusing them of keeping out of the war and running around having sort of drinks parties instead of, joining the military and helping the country. However, that story really was sort of debunked because the majority of them ignored that advice and did their best to come back, especially David Niven, who was already a trained officer. So he flew back to England immediately. But Olivier, he was light. So when he eventually got back, and he just married Vivian Leigh, when he got back to Britain from America, he'd made a couple of propaganda films, but he joined the Fleet Air Arm. And Ralph Richardson was his friend, and he was in the Fleet Air Arm. And he spent his time just flying sort of walruses and things and doing target practice and things. And he wasn't overly happy because apparently when he was at Worthy Down, RAF Worthy Down, Fleet Air Arm Worthy Down, um, the other men just laughed at him and said his hair was too brill creamed, his shoes were too shiny, and he was never going to fit in. And he was a bit of a, bad pilot, to be honest. Everybody knew it. And then he was rescued in a way because Churchill threw all this money at him and said, "Go and make a propaganda film." And so he made Henry V. And then, ironically, it came out after the war, so it was a bit nuts. But it was an interesting he was an interesting one to sort of highlight. So we had him, and then I looked at Vivian Leigh, and when she got back to England, she just didn't want to fanny around in the theatre. She decided she wanted to help the war effort, and she went off to North Africa with Ensa, ruined her house. All this idea about how glamorous and beautiful she was. She had this idea that beauty was a curse and no one would take her seriously. So we looked at that element with her, and then of course with the camera, I looked at Dirk Bogarde after training as an artist. Really, he worked with people like Graham Sutherland and his wife Kathleen at the Chelsea Art School, and met all sorts of people because originally he wanted to be a scenic artist. Then he got into acting. He was eventually called up. And he'd written his own memoirs. I think it was 8 volumes of memoir about what it was like having to join the army. They didn't know what to do with him, and he became what's known as a draft of one. And as an officer, they sent him off to RAF Medmenham, where he studied photo reconnaissance. So this is where the camera started to evolve for him. And of course, he became tremendously well known for European cinema, working in film as well. And I was lucky enough to meet Dirk Bogarde. And in a way, he inspired the whole book because I was some sort of, giddy-eyed young reporter writing the show business page in the Kent Evening Post. And he was at the King's School, Rochester in 1992 to talk to the boys there about the Holocaust. And his story was tremendously interesting because there was someone around at the time called David Irving who was running around denying the Holocaust ever took place, and Dirk Bogarts went to tell the boys that it bloody well did, because he walked into Velsen 2 days after it had been liberated. He talked about this to them, about what he saw, and he told me some, pretty eyebrow raising stories, which have stuck with me and which I included in the book. I'd gone to interview him just to talk about what was it like to work with people like Ava Gardner and all these big names, etc. But he had such a different perspective on it. He said after the war, it changed his attitude towards films and movies, and in such a way that yeah, it very much, the war very much influenced what work he went on to do, and the war films like Appointment in London, which you probably know, Steve, which is about Bomber Command. It's probably one of the most famous of the Bomber Command films. It was very good, very gritty, very authentic, lots of documentary value in that film. And then from Dirk, I looked at Audie Murphy because he was the action part of the book. So we had lights, camera, and the action. And Audie Murphy, of course, possibly the world's most decorated soldier. Incredible man. He was, joined up at 17, turned away twice because he was too young. What he didn't do during, wartime is just, yeah, it was just incredible when you read the stories of him, the bravery. I think the number's 32. He's allegedly killed 32 men solo, and his bravery was, unmistakable. So many Purple Hearts, all the medals that you could possibly wish for. And he was discovered by Jimmy Cagney, who was looking for the poster boy. He was on the picture post, Life magazine, I think it's called in America. And he appeared in 1946. He was coming out of the army, and Jimmy Cagney thought, this is what America needs, this young hero. Let's turn him into a big movie star. I can make some money out of him. He was sent to acting school, hated it. So he ended up being in westerns because he was just brilliant with guns, but suffering terribly with PTSD. When you look at the things he got up to, the other actors didn't like working with him because he'd attack them if they said something he didn't like. And the stories go on of how, you didn't upset Audie Murphy and you didn't talk to his wife and this kind of thing. And yeah, he hated actors. He didn't like the showbiz world. He just thought it was inauthentic. But it was looking at the war and how it affected all these different people in so many different ways. And then the only person Audie Murphy wanted to work with, the director, was John Huston, because he was very much the alpha male, and Murphy very much admired Eisenhower, and he felt John Huston was very much like him, a sort of man's man. John Huston actually made a very good documentary that the Americans banned, which was about soldiers suffering from PTSD. And of course, it's very much what Audie Murphy did not get any help to cope with, after the war. And and by the 1950s, his kind of career had gone into a massive decline, and he was struggling for money. But as you know, he died in a plane crash when he was in his early 40s. So Audie Murphy, yeah, they were all a book each, really. But yeah, I only had a certain amount of words to put into one volume.
So, Melody, you've also done the book Dad's Army Goes to War as well, exploring some of the most lovable characters in British comedy. Anything you learnt from that?
Well, Dad's Army Goes to War came out of from the battlefield to big screen. So, as I mentioned, I couldn't fit everybody in. And then I noticed that 98% of the Dad's Army cast had all served in the war. And I was fortunate that I could look at lots of biographies. I was really lucky to get Ian Lavender, before he died, to write the introduction. And he told me a lot about the reactions, if any of them were asked about the war. and the majority of them, especially John Laurie, who served in the First World War, and Arnold Ridley, never wanted to speak to anyone about it at all. Occasionally, Ian Lavin saw them in the corner together talking, and the odd tear. John Laurie once saw a picture that Jimmy Perry, the writer, showed him of the First World War of the Somme, and he was very upset and said, "Take it down, laddie. I don't want to be reminded of it." They suffered the most, I think, both those two actors. Um, John Le Mesurier and Arthur Lowe had fairly measured war careers. Arthur Lowe more or less straight into Ensa, really, messing about on the stage in Cairo. I just remembered being really struck by Arthur Lowe. Arthur Lowe as well, but mostly Arnold Ridley's story about struggle and survival, First World War. It is remarkable. And then, of course, someone who suffered from PTSD all of his life and yet carried on acting. And I was looking at the authenticity that they were putting into the role, but being very mindful that the script was comedic and they were in these situations which Jimmy Perry and David Croft had experienced, which were comical. We all know the one with chasing the barrage balloon, and all this actually happened during Jimmy Perry's young days in the Home Guard. Some of these antics, and then struggling with the Bofors gun, and you've got all these men running around this piece of kit. I just found it was magical the way the characters were embellished, if you like, with these stories of what actually happened, and yet all of those actors that were terribly affected by it, well, they just hid it all, and they say it's masking now, but they acted over it and used what they could to make it as authentic as possible. And I think that's why it still grabs everyone's attention, because they all want to see how England was acting on the home front, and it was all presented by these people who'd actually experienced the reality of it. Clive Dunn, another one who'd had an extraordinary war. He was a prisoner of war for most of it, being treated pretty badly by the Germans in an Austrian prisoner of war camp. And he got captured in Greece. So he felt very resentful the way Churchill decided to dump him and several other men in the whole of Greece, and expecting them to hold the Germans back. So he had some alarming experiences as well, really.
Let's move on to your book that's just about to come out. So, Love as Strong as Death, which we're very fortunate to be able to publish here at Fighting High. So, Love as Strong as Death, it centres on the disappearance of the war artist Eric Ravilious and a Hudson aircraft over Iceland. How did you first get drawn to this particular story?
I think I explained to you earlier on, you probably got the impression that I've spent my life chasing stories, if you like, because I felt they're important to capture in a net, if you like, get them in the newspaper. It's all in my blood to do that, or get them into a book. But this one found me, which arrived just one day on an email. Would you like to come and talk to me about my father, who's in Coastal Command? And the email came from a lady called Carol Lockwood, and Carol doesn't live too far away from me. And I was having a bit of a rest because I just finished the Dad's Army book, and I was wanting to sort of regroup, if you like, and wonder what I ought to do next. And I thought, first of all, Coastal Command was something I didn't know anything about. I knew a little of Fighter Command. I knew about the ATA, and I was thinking, well, yeah, Bomber Command and Coastal Command, very much, an area of. I mean, I'd met a lovely Bomber Command pilot, but Coastal Command was, was soon to find out, was like the Cinderella service of the Second World War. And Carol said to me, "Oh, please come along." And I've got all the letters from my father that he sent home. And I went to see her, and I was going to write a feature originally. I thought, well, this would be a good feature. But then the more I talked to Carol, the more I saw this massive archive of letters and memorabilia almost like a shrine that her mother had kept to her father, Flight Lieutenant Alfred Ginge Culver, who died September 2nd, 1942, flying over Iceland. I found out that on board that day was Eric Ravilious, the war artist, and it took me along a whole nother journey. So I felt I was writing about two men, two books, two sets of families, all in between one cover. So yeah, it was. I think it was the book that found me, and I there were moments during the writing of that book where I was quite overwhelmed. I think I've said that in my own introduction about reimagining the landscape, and I got very drawn into the idea of this sort of like, yeah, the cruelties of the North, and I began to look at the era, and I began to look at Eric Ravilious and what inspired him, and how he worshipped the idea of the North, how he called it his forgotten paradise. He was desperate to go there, and it started to make me really get in touch with kind of fate and what was going on and what inspired these men. And I kept coming back all the time, having read all the letters from Ginge to Olive, his wife, Carol's mother. And Carol never knew her father. She was 8 weeks old when he was killed. It just brought me back to this whole kind of supernaturalness, if you like, of love. I mean, you're in this war, and these pilots, these air crews went back again and again and again and again to in Coastal Command, Bomber Command, Fighter Command, all of them, especially Coastal Command, to fly over these great stretches of water looking for U-boats, never knowing ever if they're going to come back. And Ginger been sent to the most extreme place in Iceland, the Caldadarnis, where, the survival rate wasn't great. And you look at the way his letters become more and more serious, and he expresses his love to Olive more and more and more through these letters. And it was something was driving me. I mean, once again, it was like, a vein had been opened, and it was really making me kind of examine and wring out every sort of ounce of humanity that I could actually experience, to imagine what it was like for them. And sometimes I don't know how I did it. I don't know what was driving me to push this forward, apart from reading as much as I could about Ravilious. And I was very lucky because his daughter, Anne Ullman, really lovely, lovely lady, as a friend of Carol, because of this experience, they joined together. um, she never knew her father. She was a toddler when he last saw her mother, Tirzah. But her mother, Tirzah Darwood, was also an artist, and she wrote a very good memoir, which Anne edited. So it was from that, really, and two ladies who were Ravilious's lovers, because he did enjoy female company. They wrote some extraordinary anecdotes and memories of him. So I began to feel I liked both of these men. I would have probably got on quite well with them, their outlook, their opinions, etc., and why they were doing what they were doing. And it all comes through this sort of, yeah, supernaturalness that came from love and passion and dedication. So I guess it overrode the fear, really. And I guess they thought perhaps they were untouchable, but they had to have something. And of course, as you know, in the RAF, if you said you didn't want to fly, then you got LMF written on your logbook. So you were cornered, really. And I was thinking, what else was there apart from religion? But sometimes it didn't kind of cut the mustard. So you had to have something, didn't you, to keep you dedicated and in the flow.
There's definitely a poetic quality to the story that you've written, the North and Iceland, and there's a simplicity of Iceland and the North. I've been to Iceland, and it's very raw when you're there. And Ravilius's art is very simple. It's very mood. It's very feeling as well. And it just brings the book brings that all together, really, I think.
Thank you. Thank you.
Why do you think Ravilius's art resonates so much with us still?
He's one of these artists that, probably perhaps the only one, there's such a stillness that it goes back to the old days when I first learned to be a newspaper reporter, asking the who, why, what, where, when, and how. I'm thinking in particular to his painting of the I think it was around the outbreak of war, September 39. He's painted 3 chairs around a table with an umbrella, and there's a teapot. I think it's laid for tea, but there's no people there. He'd paint bedrooms where there's the bed and there's damp wallpaper. And there's always this kind of sense what's happened to the humans who should be in this picture. And I loved all of that. The way he'd paint a depth charge on a ship, and that was it. And you'd look out to sea and you'd see this weapon of destruction. And you ask yourself what's going to happen to it, where's it going to land? And I think it was so wonderful when you chose the painting of HMS Glorious appear on the front of the book, because it was an aircraft carrier, and he's painted the hurricanes circling around it like birds. And I very much got this idea of, the sort of the dead sailors at sea, yeah, the spirits of the dead sailors, and you've got these aircraft, and they were spinning, they were flying round and round the Glorious, because it was the first time that hurricanes have ever landed on an aircraft carrier. So there was all this history coming out of this painting. You got the sun sort of dazzling you, and you've got the shadow of the U-boat, and he'd fitted so much in there and not a face inside. So it leaves you to think and think and think about what you're actually seeing. And then, like some spooky prophecy, within weeks that ship had gone and there were hundreds of men killed. And the other extra to that story was another ship sailed by them and couldn't rescue them because on board were the King and Queen of Norway, because they had to get them back to. So, yeah, he was very good at a kind of simpleness. But if you do look at any of the faces, he didn't like painting faces. He admitted that. But if you look at the faces of the men in the submarines and the lithographs, they're just chiseled features, and they're just full of grit and determination. So I started to learn about his approach, about the importance of light to him. That's why he wanted to go to Iceland, was to fly that morning, the last morning, to look at the light at dawn when the aircraft had gone on a rescue mission. And I imagined what he was doing when he got in the aircraft that morning, where he wanted to sit, rear gunner's seat. So I kind of learned all the kind of things that he wanted to look out for when he was going to, compose a painting, if you like. And they're simple and yet so effective. And he loved to fly. He loved flying, and there's nothing he loved more than was to sit in a tiger moth flying, looking for, you've probably seen the paintings. I think one of them's in the book, actually, of him looking through the propeller, and you've got these aircraft flying around, and he's sitting there with a pencil. So he's not painting in the aircraft. He used to paint the images that he wanted, draw the images, sketch them, but he wanted to then go back and think about the colours and then put them on. So, yeah, it is the simplicity of them. I think they're just so evocative. Anything that he did, the landscapes, he always chose landscapes that were going to, spark off this idea, oh, that looks beautiful. And then in the distance, you'll see something like, yeah, dark going on. I think when he painted the coast, when he was at Dover, over in Calais, around the French coast, you could see all these sort of like puffs of smoke and things where it looks very scenic, like the Riviera. And then look further in the distance, and you've got all this sort of blackness coming from where Bomber Command were dropping bombs along the coast of Calais or wherever. So it was, yeah, there was always something to see in his pictures, and you didn't always have to have humans.
No, well, the I know the chairs painting you're referring to. It's very much the empty chairs at empty tables, isn't it? The portent of what's to come. And so the pilot, Ginge Culver, and his relationship with his wife Olive. We've got the letters, and we can really go into their relationship. And clearly you wanted to bring out the humanity of them as individuals and their relationship and how the war was affecting them.
I did, and, like a lot of things, small things affect us, don't they? The small sort of nitty-gritty, and the detail in the letters just, made me very emotional, the things he sent her home, he's always saving money and talking about, yeah, putting the money in the bank account, and especially, how things were going with the flying, and yet his attention was always on her, how she was feeling, what their friends had said, and he never, probably because of the laws at the time, but he never really talked about his emotion, but you knew it must be there. So you think about what conversations they may have had when they weren't writing letters, because sometimes they dried up. But I thought it was the details, that the effort he put in to, asking her what did she do with the material he sent her home from Iceland. And do you remember this anecdote? Do you remember that anecdote? It was just the sort of yeah, the great connection they'd had and the way they'd met, and it was immediate attraction, and it was just a wonderful romance, I guess, that saw him through, and it was the most precious things, as well as the small things that sort of make up life, and to remind them that they were human and they weren't supernatural. And he was a pilot, and it was desperate to be a pilot, but I liked the way that he was very honest, and sometimes wondered what he was doing, why he was doing it, and even suggested at one point that after he came out of this, what were they going to do? And I talked to Carol about that, and she said, "Well, of course, you never knew." She said, "I'll never know, and no one would ever know if they would have stayed together, because of course they never lived together properly, as man and wife, because he was always stationed somewhere or in lodgings or something. So they never had that sort of home family life with her. That us alleged normal people would have done, because it was always flying and it was always the war that interrupted." So she said, for all I know, they were always living in this honeymoon period, because he was 25 when he was killed. So Carol often wonders, yeah, would it have lasted if he had come out of the war? So she's got quite a realistic sort of grip on it all, but she does always wish she'd always obviously she wished she knew her father, and then did get to go to Iceland with her husband Derek. And I think I told you, Steve, or in the book, we talk about how she went and she stood on the runway 72 years after he'd taken off for the last time, and felt a chill run up her spine. So that was Carol's memory and DNA kicking in. And surprisingly, she's not afraid of flying. I think I'd be worried about it. But she said, "Oh no, I enjoyed it." And she was very lucky to fly over everywhere, where he would have known, and go where we would have known.
The book very much brings out Olive's story as well, and that aspect and the challenges that she faced bringing up a newborn baby on her own, having to clothe, having to feed the baby. That long letter, she talks about breastfeeding and the challenges, and you can just picture Ginge just sitting there reading that and trying to imagine how he's feeling, being so far away, but yet he's by this piece of paper in front of him. He's so close to them as well. Um, and it brings me on to another question to ask you, which we've mentioned before, because you're dealing with a lot of in this book and other books, separation and loss and war. And I think someone asked you if you enjoyed writing these books, and it's what does enjoy mean when you're writing these kind of books?
It does. It's a strange word, isn't it? It was actually Carol who, twice now, she said, "Oh, did you enjoy it? Did you enjoy it?" I said, "Well, it is a strange word, because we enjoy fish and chips, don't we? And ice cream, and gin and tonic, wine. But it kind of seems a flippant word when you think about, did I, yeah, enjoy it? I had a massive experience, if you want to put it like that, because it made me examine my own kind of, yeah. sense of everything and so much. So it taught me a lot, and the people I wrote about have taught me a lot. And it's helped validate various kind of ways I can see the world, and asked me what would I do in that situation, and made me kind of realize there might have not have been anything else I could do, um, because the world was very different then. It didn't seem as fractured as it did now. I might be just, be supposing that, but yeah, it certainly taught me. They all, I think, probably taught me a lot, really. And I found that every now and then you can go down a rabbit hole and come out the other end having learned something more. Because all of them, I found that they all branched off into these other areas. And now it's completely got me on this line of looking at the way war has inspired artists, well, through the centuries in so many different ways. And looking at the life of war artists and looking at the dedication. I mean, one person I was really drawn to was Paul Nash, who taught Eric Ravilious, who was his guru, if you like. And then I looked at a life of Paul Nash, and I don't know if you know, but he was quite famous for Totes Meer, this famous painting of all the German aircraft all sort of gnarled up, lying there in pieces, because all at sea, I think it means, or dead at sea. And I thought about the wreck hunter, and I thought it's such an incredible image, and the way everything has to be encapsulated in a frame. It's quite a challenge. So yeah, I've been looking at all of Ravilious's contemporaries, and I've read a lot of Edward Vorden and Ardizoni and John Piper. They've all got something to say, to represent art, and of course Paul Nash very much influenced filmmakers like Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, who I do a talk about for the Art Society. All of those propaganda films, especially The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, which Churchill hated because he said it was a satire on the British military. But Colonel Blimp, in the First World War scenes, it's very painterly. So film directors like Michael Powell were looking at the influence of Paul Nash for backdrop scenes and the sort of the stillness that he, I think, created in his art, which then was instilled in Ravilious. So I like to look at where all the influences were coming from, and how fortunate, if it was very powerful, it bled into the film work of people like Michael Powell as well.
Clearly, you find all this very, I don't know if enjoy is the right word there, but it's just very rewarding, isn't it?
I think it's because I start to understand more. I think it's because with maturity, like a lot of things, you start to understand more, don't you? And understand the importance of layers, and how we can interpret and how we can perceive, and what can we get out of it. Do we ever learn anything from war? I don't know. I guess it's probably, possibly, horribly, upsettingly no.
Yeah, I always find connecting information you find out about, crafting it to present it, it is it's rewarding.
Yeah,
It's satisfying, which
I
sounds
agree.
very self-indulgent, but it is, yeah.
There was one little motivator that I always think about. You know the author Philip Pullman. I think he said something like, nobody wants to read about do's and don'ts. What they want to read or hear about is once upon a time. I think that's I think that's quite a nice little kind of spur for me. Anyway,
Well, Melody, I think that's a nice way actually to finish off the interview. It's about storytelling, the once upon a time, engaging more people. So thank you, Melody, and here's looking forward to the imminent release of Love as Strong as Death. You can pre-order it now. We'll get Melody to sign some copies. You can pre-order it through the Fighting High website. And then I'm sure we'll be doing some events throughout the year as well. So keep an eye on the website for that. So thank you very much, Melody.
thank you, Steve.
Thanks for listening to the Fighting High podcast. You can follow Fighting High on X using @FightingHigh. Visit fightinghigh.com for details about books, and follow the Fighting High publishing page on Facebook. If you have enjoyed this podcast, then please follow or subscribe and leave us a review.